All right, as there's no questions, couple of reminders for this week. I will send out an announcement later, but a couple of announcements we need to make sure we pay attention to. Chapter 12 homework is due tonight. And on Wednesday, you're going to have 2 quizzes due, both A and B. So don't skip out on Wednesday night. Okay, please don't send me an email and say, Dr. Walshad, I forgot to do a quiz. I will send an announcement today telling you this, and I'm telling you this now. There are 2 quizzes due on Wednesday. So please make sure you handle both quizzes. And then on Friday will be Chapter 13 homework. For the next kind of module, we have 6 chapters. So we have to go a little quicker than a chapter a week. So please make sure you always pay attention to the calendar. You should have printed out the syllabus schedule, or I would have. And wherever you're working on econ is I would have it next to it. So I always made sure I was on task and doing what I was supposed to. I try not to change the syllabus one bit. So that's kind of where things are. What are we in? I think we're in the 8th week. So it'll be 2 more weeks before a test. So please kind of prepare yourself and make sure you're paying attention to where things are in the class. If there are not any questions, then we'll start with today's lecture. In today's discussion, we're going to finish Chapter 12. So if you remember from Wednesday, when we talked about Chapter 12, we're talking about economic growth. Well, maybe we are. All right. We're talking about economic growth. My hope was my pin. Oh, there it is. So we're talking about economic growth. All right. And that relates to productivity, or how productive we are as a society and how much we can change that. We talked about before, there are 4 determinants of productivity. Physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. And we talked about how this is probably, natural resources is the least important. It's valuable. We're not saying that it's better not to have natural resources than to have them. But if we had to give up one of these, we could give up natural resources and still be able to accommodate the others. It's really hard for a country to give up physical capital and not be able to grow. We find very, very few, if we don't find actually any examples of places that have given up physical capital that can't grow. Same thing with human capital, same thing with technological knowledge. You can find countries that are very lacking in natural resources that are still able to grow. But you cannot find countries that lack physical capital, human capital, and technological knowledge are able to grow and be rich. So we're going to continue our discussion on how does the government enable these, or how does the government, I guess enable isn't the correct word. How do they encourage growth? Okay, how do they encourage it? Okay, and on Monday we talked about they want to encourage us to save. It's kind of strange, but even though savings might have a short-term dip, in the long term, we talked about it pushes savings upward. I mean, it pushes economic growth upward. It pushes standard of living upward. It pushes productivity upward. Right? And we talked also about the catch-up effect, that the poor countries are able to grow faster than rich countries. And we focused this on physical capital. So we're going to continue our discussion today about how the governments encourage economic growth. How do we encourage more productivity in a country? So if this was a year ago, we would talk about the U.S. savings rate, and we would talk about the U.S. savings rate being relatively poor. With this pandemic, you can look at most measures of U.S. savings rate, and they have skyrocketed for the individual. We'll talk about it in Chapter 13. But private savings have significantly increased in this past year compared to previous. And that's private savings are what's done by individual households. However, the problem is public savings, what's done by the government, has not. In fact, we have gone bigger into deficit. So there's kind of a trade-off there. And we'll talk about in chapter 13 where savings directly relates to the ability of a country to invest. So what happens if I have low savings? How do I get more investment in my country? Well, a way for us to get more investment in our country if we have low savings is to look at investment from abroad. So that means foreign investment. So a good country is looking to receive investment from abroad. If we can't have the savings with our own country or with our own city or with our own state, it's better for us to have capital than no capital at all. A lot of times this is a very political thing. We don't like foreign owners of fill in the blank. And foreign is kind of relative. We can talk about it sometimes at the city level. We don't want people investing their money in our city, in our country. They don't live here. Well, why not? If they're going to invest in new physical capital, this physical capital is going to give growth where the capital is. Not where the person who bought the capital is from, but where the capital is. As we build new factories, new buildings, new equipment in Fort Smith, that allows Fort Smith to grow. Same thing works for Arkansas. Same thing works for the country. That's why countries or cities, states are always trying to get new business, is they're trying to get people to invest new capital in their city, their locale, their country. And since we're going to talk about this from a macro perspective, we're going to look more big picture. So remember, we're always looking at the biggest picture possible. So we're always kind of looking at it from a country level. So when we talk about there's going to be two ways we get foreign investment. I'm not really happy about the second one, but again, I don't get to control terminology. I only get what the book gives us. And the one that's really investment is the first one. Often, if you see it, sometimes abbreviated, it's called FDI, foreign direct investment. That is a company, individuals taking their savings from another country and bringing them here in the United States to invest. So that's a Japanese company taking Japanese savings and bringing those savings to the US to build a factory here for our workers. That's what we call foreign direct investment. Foreign portfolio investment is they don't actually really invest. We're just taking the savings from another country, usually China, and then as domestic residents, we use that savings how we deem valuable. Okay, so this would be like GM going and borrowing savings from Chinese citizens and then deciding where to build a factory here in the United States with Chinese savings. So that's kind of not quite foreign investments, really foreign savings into US investment, but they do call them both investment. So this investment, the second one, is usually done through stocks and bonds. Is foreign citizens save into stocks and bonds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 13. And kind of the difference between what's actually investment and what actually is savings. But the first one is the biggest component of increasing investment. Okay. Even though some of the benefits will flow back to the foreign country. This is where most people get hung up. I don't get 100% of the benefits. True, you don't. Because the foreign owners will get some of the benefits. But it's a hard time for people to understand, well, I got 80% of the benefits. Well, 80% of any number is greater than zero. Unless it's zero. Right? So if you think about it, if I got 80% of the investment here in Fort Smith, that means I got 80% of something, which is better than zero. But 20% went away. Okay, it did. But what would I have gotten without the investment? Remember, it's opportunity cost. It's not what we want, it's what's the actual cost. Okay, the choices are I get a foreign firm or I get nothing. Well, I want a foreign firm. Okay, so we have to understand what are we giving up by saying no. And it's hard for a lot of people to not get 100% of the benefits. You see it everywhere. It's not just a countrywide phenomenon. You see it a lot in small cities, small towns. They struggle with having big city people come in and invest in their city, in their area. You will see some of it. Now, again, some of you probably can talk about there's a historical relevance to it, but we're not going to get into that. We just know it occurs. But the ability is I get higher wages, I get state-of-the-art technologies because I'm not going to make an investment in old technology. Right? I'm not going to build a factory that's brand new using old ideas. If I'm going to build a factory, I'm going to build the best because I'm going to try to have a factory, a capital built to make us more productive in the future. I'm not going to use the oldest technology. I'm going to use the newest and best technology. And as I said, it's especially good for poor countries that can't generate enough savings to invest projects themselves. The funny part of this is most foreign direct investment actually goes from poor countries to rich countries. And that has reasons to do with other things. But you got to think, if we think about the catch-up effect, the poor countries is where I get the biggest bang for my buck. However, it comes with other risk. Well, the rich country, I'm not going to get as big as reward, but it's going to be a safer reward. And a lot of times we see businesses that will move where they believe the reward to be safe. And they're not worried about other activities. So those are kind of the two main ways we get physical capital, is we get physical capital mostly through savings. We'll talk about that in chapter 13. That the more a country saves, the greater the investment, the greater the physical capital. So we're going to move on to the next one. And this is education. So how do I get more human capital in a country? Well, I get more education. And the more the investment in human capital, what we end up with is, whether right or wrong, is we're going to end up with income inequality. It's a big discussion right now in the world. Why do we have so much income inequality? A lot of income inequality is driven by this one factor: the difference between educated and uneducated workers. You can go and you can look at almost any statistic you want. Over the years, college educated workers and ones who have not graduated high school, that gap is getting bigger and bigger over time. So the ones who have the least amount of education in our society, their wages are shrunk over the years. While those at the top, college educated, even a little bit of high school, are continuing to grow. So the more education you have, we talked about the higher standard of living. You're coming to college selfishly. You probably aren't coming to college for the love of knowledge. You're coming to college to make an investment in human capital, because you're trying to get yourself more human capital. And why do you want more human capital? Because you want to be paid more. And we see you have. Opportunity cost of education. All right, we talked about the biggest cost of education, and that's at any level, are the wages you give up. So the more opportunity, or the higher the wage you have to give up to go to school, the less likely you are to go to school. That applies everywhere, right down to elementary school, all the way up to graduate level. All of that plays a role as a wages foregone. We don't think a lot of wages foregone in elementary school because we don't have children workers here in the United States, but other countries do. And sometimes why they have labor issues or they have issues there is because the cost of school is too much. Even if it's free, it's never free because you always have to give up what you could be doing working. And we talked a little bit at the beginning of the semester, it confers positive externalities. The more educated we are as a society, the better off we are. And because of that, we do see huge subsidies into public education. So every student here is receiving a subsidy to go to attend college. How you see that in public schools is you don't pay your full tuition. The government pays part of the tuition for you to come to here at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith. So it's about half and half. You pay half, the government pays half. Some of it's more. So what's the right level of subsidies to education is a debate and question. But right now we are subsidizing all levels of education. The colleges are paid for by government. One of the problems though we see with education is we see something called brain drain. And we see it in poor countries, poor states, and poor cities. And what do I mean by brain drain? Well, what happens is if you look at the best colleges in the world, and they're all in the US, or most of them are. So people from other countries come to the US for their education. And they get educated in the US. And they become accustomed to our standard of living. The problem is they don't want to go back to their other country. Why? Because it has lower standard of living, lower opportunities. So what we see is a lot of times when people move from poor areas into richer areas, a lot of times where education is, at least higher education, they have a tendency not to move back. And what this causes then is it causes their area to lose human capital as we see these opportunities disappear. You can see it, I said, you can look at it from country standpoint, but you can see it here in the city standpoint. If you look at Arkansas, and you can go and I don't know how many of you are from a small city, but if you look at what's happening in small cities in Arkansas, especially in the rural areas, what's happening is we see this kind of dying off as these cities are becoming worse off. Well, why? Because what's happened is they've experienced brain drain. As their best and brightest have often gone away and they don't come back. And so over time, what happens is these cities start to get less and less human capital. If you have less and less human capital, standard of living falls. So it happens in whether it's cities, states, or countries. And it's a lot of times why certain areas want universities in those areas, because they want to take advantage of brain drain. They want to try to drive people to their university, they'll stay, and they'll create more opportunities in that area. Second part of human capital is health and nutrition. If we have healthier workers, they are more productive. And most of the time when we're talking here health, is we focused on nutrition. Again, remember this is kind of an international class and we don't think a lot about nutrition here in the United States. Most of it's not a problem with nutrition here in the United States, or at least what we call caloric intake. We might have an issue on what kind of caloric intake we have, but calories not usually a problem here in the United States. Now, maybe the right kind of calories is a different story, but for the most part, when we talk here, we focus about health and nutrition, we're talking about caloric intake. That means just having enough calories to sustain our life. So that's quite a bit, it's slightly different than maybe the US problem of the wrong food, but we do have calories. Here we're just talking about the lack of calories. And we can see from 62 to 65, South Korea, one of the growth countries, experienced higher caloric consumption. And economic growth was spectacular. The problem with this is it's a either vicious cycle or it's a virtuous cycle. The problem is if I'm poor I have a hard time affording food. And if I can't afford food, I'm going to be less productive. If I'm less productive, I become more poor. I become poorer. If I become poorer, I can afford less food. And so you can see how the cycle works kind of in a bad way. However, there's also what they call a virtuous cycle. As I become richer, I can afford more food. I get more food. I become more productive. I'm more productive. I get higher wages. Get higher wages, I can then go into more and more better food. So there is this policies that want to make sure if we want economic growth, we should pay attention to how we allocate food. And are there ways to try to encourage caloric intake at the bottom? How we can see economic growth, it's kind of a funny way to look at economic growth. But a lot of the ways we see economic growth is in height. If you pay attention to demographics, and if you look at what's happened to the average male in the United States over 100 years, what's happened to their height? Well, their heights have gotten taller. Well, why have they gotten taller? Well, because we have more and more to eat. And as we have more and more to eat, we don't have a caloric deficit. And so what we're able to reach is our potential height. As humans, we have potential height. Not all of us reach that due to not enough calories as children. And we can't quite reach our potential. In the United States, this is becoming less and less of a problem. We're reaching our potential heights, but you can go usually and look at places in Africa that are not having enough food. Especially, it was prevalent in Asia. Is why sometimes they saw less height. Well, because they didn't have enough food. And if you go, especially, and you look at places like China and South Korea, and you look at their average height over the past 30 years, the average height of their individuals has gone up. Well, why has it gone up? Well, they've had enough caloric intake to maximize and reach their height. So now we're going to focus, those are kind of the two major ones for human capital. Now we're going to focus on one that's kind of for all of them. That works for productivity in general. And this one is probably one of the most important ones, is property rights. We talked about in chapter 1 that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. We talked about how as individuals, I don't work for myself, I work for somebody else. I create a product not for me and for my own happiness, but I create a product that I'm going out to the market to sell for other people. It doesn't matter what business you're in. You're in a business of service. Whether you're producing a product or producing a service, you're really in the business of servicing someone else, meeting someone else's needs. And usually the person best able to meet someone else's needs is the person who's serving them. So if I'm creating a product for my customers, who probably knows best of what my customers want is me. And the only way that happens is the government gets out of my way and lets me build my product for my customers. And the way they do that is they allow me what we call property rights. Is I have the ability to exercise authority over the resources I own. So I can do what I want with my time and my property. And what we have are courts, the military, police officers, lawyers, and what their major job is to make sure I keep my property rights, is to make sure I'm able to protect it. And I'm willing to give up some of my property rights to protect them. Right? That's why we pay taxes, because I want police officers and firefighters and military and courts, because I want them to protect my property rights from people stealing them. Is that if I work for it and I own it, I want to be able to reap the benefits. I don't want it stolen. So that's why we have Police, military, firefighters, courts. That's their job, is to make sure somebody doesn't steal my property rights, doesn't take from me without my consent. So that's the role. And we do that is so we have stability. If we know what the rules are, then we can decide what to do with our resources. And we're going to decide what's best for us to do with our resources. And that's how we decide and how we make good property, how we make good economic growth. And we find you can go through multiple examples. When countries take property rights from individuals, economic growth shrinks. Because people understand the best way to produce goods and services. If we don't have property rights, we talk about contracts, hard to enforce. So you're going to have fraud and corruption goes unpunished. We don't know who's doing it. And in order to get something done, if the government controls power, the only way you can get things done through the government is you bribe them. It could be outright bribes, or it could be campaign contributions. But the more power you give the government to control work, you have to find a way to influence them. And this almost always leads to political instabilities, revolutions, coups. Right? If we create uncertainty over whether property rights will be protected. So you can look at a lot of times when we see unrest. It doesn't matter where you see unrest, but most of the time when you see unrest in this country, what people are worried about are their property rights. Is what I did going to be protected? Is it going to be protected from fraud, corruption, unused force? And when you're unstable or you're uncertain that your property rights aren't going to be protected, that's when we start to see unrest. And a major job of the government is to make sure that people believe their property rights are protected, that there isn't fraud and corruption. It doesn't matter, as I said, I try to be very apolitical here. It doesn't matter what side you are on. You go and you can honestly look at most unrest in this country is because people are uncertain about their property rights. They're worried about some type of fraud or corruption going on in the government. Now, whether that's right or wrong, it's not what's stopping instability. Instability is over the belief, the uncertainty of it. And so part of the job of the government is to make sure that we're certain our property rights are protected. And they're protected fairly and honestly. And that goes a long way in creating stability, and with stability, we can see economic growth. That's an exercise I typically do, and the next one is we talk about property rights. The next one I often talk about is free trade. And I ask students to think about the richest cities in the world. Think about the cities where there is lots of wealth. If we were in class, we'd write them on the board. You'd probably tell me, oh, hey, New York City. You'd say Los Angeles. You might go overseas and go London, Paris. You might say like Hong Kong. You give me a list. And I go, well, that's a beautiful list. But what do all of these have in common? You gave me a list of cities. What do all of these cities have in common? And I will help you out. All of these cities have in common is they are all located on or near water. You can go and look. Well, what does water have anything to do with being rich? Dr. Walsh, you told me what was rich. Physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. Where does water come into play? Well, water, I guess a natural resource is going to come into play in trade. As trade makes everyone better off. And there's no coincidence that the richest cities in the world have always been located on ports. Why? Because most trade is still done and has been done through water. And so what we find is countries that are very inward oriented, that try to avoid interaction with other countries, tariffs, limits on investment from abroad, are typically very poor countries. So a lot of times what economists do is we like to go and we like to look at things called natural experiments. So these are things that happened in the world where we get two sides of a coin, and they occurred arbitrarily. And probably one of the biggest examples we have are the Koreas. There was a Korean War in the 1950s, and at the end of the, well, it's not the end of it, I guess we ended just recently, but we came up with a stalemate. And at the stalemate is we just drew an imaginary line on the map and said, this is North, this is South Korea. We didn't come up with any rhyme or reason where that line was drawn. It was drawn on an actual number. It wasn't just drawn, oh, well, this is where, there was no rhyme or reason to it. We just came up with a number and said, North here, South. And then what happens is we looked at what these countries did. So if you go and you look at North Korea, they avoided interaction with the rest of the world, put huge tariffs, limits on investment, limits on anybody from overseas. While South Korea began integration with the rest of the world, eliminated restrictions on trade, an example. And what can you see is this country, South Korea, became rich and North Korea became poor. So we see how these just simple ideas about trade make huge differences in countries. But remember, trade is very similar to technological knowledge. Countries with inward policies have failed to create growth. If you go and you look, we talked about Argentina in 1900 was a very rich country. Today, it's not considered that. And if you look at a lot of their policies have been inward oriented. Well, you go to a lot of what we call the Asian tigers, very outward, have tried to integrate with the rest of the world. They've grown really quickly. And as they've grown, now they're starting to see more wanting from other countries to invest in their countries, to bring foreign investment in. And they're actually starting to be a little more inward oriented, and they're slowing down their growth. Because if you're inward oriented, growth slows. You open yourself up, you get more growth. So now we're going to move on to technological knowledge. We're going to cover this really quickly. Probably the best way we seek technological knowledge is by the encouragement of research and development. They call it R&D. So what we do to try to encourage technological progress is we try to encourage research. We do that through patent laws. Is that if you create a new idea, you get to keep control of it for a certain period of time. So you get a monopolistic control. We create tax incentives. And we encourage universities to do research. That is part of the role and scope of a university. All universities are expected to create research. As a professor, I am seen as part of my goal, is what makes me different than a high school teacher. As part of my job is to expand the knowledge base in economics. If I was teaching high school, my only job would be to teach classes. At a university, professors are expected to do both research and teaching. So we're expected to do both. That's what we differ from your high school teacher, is we're supposed to be at the cutting edge of our field, is we're trying to expand it. And we also teach because that's part of our public service. And each university is slightly different. So here at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith, we focus a little more on teaching. As professors here, their jobs are slightly different than, say, if I was at Fayetteville. At Fayetteville, they're more focused here. So if you go there, you have less professors teaching classes. Well, because they're supposed to be doing a lot more research. Here at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith, our balance is more towards teaching and less towards research. Doesn't mean we don't do both. Doesn't mean in Fayetteville they don't do both. But there's a balance on what we're expected to do. So finally, the last one is probably one of the most interesting. And that deals with population growth. So here's kind of the ideas behind population growth. So we have a larger population. More workers, yay, more consumers. Okay. That's great, but remember when we talk about productivity, it's per worker, not just how much we produce overall, right? If we look at it, remember China has the biggest GDP. China has the biggest Y. But we don't care. Y doesn't tell us standard of living. Y over L tells us standard of living. In the US is a whole lot bigger than China in our standard of living. So we don't necessarily care that this large population leads to more workers in total output. We want to know what happens to Y over L. So let's talk about how this large population stresses or doesn't stress an economy. The first one is probably one of the most popular explanations for population growth. It's a very old one. Is that as we get more and more people on this earth, there is a limit to some natural resources. So we're thinking about a lot of, we'll call them non-renewables, right? Things like land, fossil fuels, minerals, etc. So as we get more and more people on this earth, they want to be fed. And we only have so much land to grow crops on. And in fact, if we get more and more people, we get less and less land to grow crops on. And because we have less and less natural resources to survive, we create this strain on society. And when you start to create this strain on society, what ends up happening, Mathis predicts, is that we're going to be doomed forever to live in poverty. Is that because Mathis saw that as we got more and more people on this earth, it's going to strain our ability to produce natural resources. It's going to strain our ability to produce food. It's going to cause natural resources prices to skyrocket. But if you remember before, we haven't seen natural resources skyrocket. In reality, we have less poverty today than we did 200 years ago, even though we have almost 6 times as many people than when Mathis made his prediction. So if we have 6 times as many people, almost, what about 7.5 billion people, I can't keep track, in the world, and living standards have not decreased. They've in fact increased. How is this possible? Well, one way is, well, you're going to go through the second explanation of population growth. It's kind of a physical capital one. So the first one focuses on natural resources, on we can't survive. Second one says, well, what's going to happen is we're only going to be able to do so much physical capital. And if we get high population growth, then what happens is we get less capital per labor. Is that we have less physical capital for each person, so we're not able to produce goods and services. Same story as Mathis, but not told through natural resources, but told through capital stock. And because of 1 and 2, a lot of countries, what they decided to do was limit population growth. And we see that in China, created a one-child law. You see this huge increase in awareness of birth control, trying to stop these poor countries from having more children. Why do poor countries have more children than rich countries? I know this is crass, but it's cheaper. Now remember, we always go back to opportunity cost. And if you think about opportunity cost, and you think about opportunity cost for women, is if women have great jobs, in order to have a child, they have to give up some of their work and some of their income. And if they have a great job, then that cost is more expensive than if they're working at minimum wage. So you see this play out on the averages, is if you go and you plot average family size, what you will see is an inverse relationship, most likely, between richer and poorer countries. Poorer countries have more children than richer countries. Why? Because of opportunity cost. So what happens is neither one of those two things have really come true. If you think about the world today, we are at the highest level of living standards in history. And next year will probably be even better. And then we continue to grow. Why have we grown even though population has exploded? Well, because what's happened is the growth of technical knowledge has outpaced the growth of population. And this is the idea behind Michael Kremer, who won the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. And what he has seen is, he says, as world grows in population, we get more people. And we get more people, that's going to translate into more scientists, more inventors, more engineers. And as we get more and more people studying those things, what ends up happening is we get more frequent discoveries. Well, how do we know this is true? Well, what he did is he went and measured patent growth. Right? How do we get to technology? Is he said, well, if we look at patent growth as kind of a proxy for technological knowledge, what we've seen is more ideas, more people, more economic growth. And he can go through, and he's done pretty much, as he won a Nobel Prize, he went and looked at multiple different ways this has come true. Why are the most populated regions grow faster than less populated? Why do the big cities grow faster than small towns? Right? Why is this come true? Highly populated areas seem to grow faster than less populated areas. And what he relates it back to is this idea. And his ideas have grown through not only economics, but you also see it in other disciplines. So why do professors make you work in groups? No, it is not to be mean and cruel. We want you to work in groups to understand teamwork, but we also want you to come up with a better project. And how do you come up with a better project is more ideas. Assuming everyone's contributing and we get more ideas and our ideas build on one another, we're able to create a better project. And the same thing works with technology and population. The more people we have, the more frequent discoveries are. So kind of a quick wrap up. I don't know. We have a little bit of time left, kind of a quick wrap up. Prosperity has varied country to country. You can go and you can look at every different country and you can see where countries fall in this world. If you're here in the United States, which all you are, our standard of living is high. Places in Africa, we go to the Caribbean, like Haiti. You can go to Asia. There's some very, very poor places in Asia. And you can see the standard of living varies quite dramatically. And it boils down to the ability to produce goods and services. That determines how rich we are. And so as I always tell students, you should be focused on how is the government improving our ability to have more physical capital, more human capital, more natural resources, more technological knowledge. How are we going to grow more in the future? How do we get there? We did talk about some of these examples: accumulation of capital, more diminishing returns, higher savings rate, we get higher growth. It eventually levels off, right, because of diminishing returns. But we do end up with higher incomes and higher standard of living in the future. Return of capital is great in poor countries. Why? Because of the catch-up effect. They don't have a lot, so a little bit of capital goes a long way. We talk a lot about how do we foster investment from abroad, education, good health, property rights, political stability, free trade, and research and development. All right, are there any questions about today's discussion? Hopefully it kind of gives you kind of a, I said I'd love to go, we just don't have enough time into great detail about some of these policies. We talked, Taylor, about the rule of 70 or 72. We talked about it on the discussion. I thought I had it in the slides. Did I not? I know I wrote it on the slides, but I know it's in, I talked about it, but it's not. But let me give you a quick thing. Let me pull up a slide here real quick. Sorry. Not hard. Let me make sure I'm presenting. You can see my slide, hopefully. It's blank. Okay. What you do is you take 72 divided by the growth rate, and that tells you the number of years it takes for the country to double. So if I'm growing at 2% a year, it takes me about 36 years to double. 2 is the only one that actually gives you a dual answer, 35 to 36. But we use the rule of 70 or 72 to cover most growth rates up to 10. Because if we think about, we can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think 8's covered. So that way we come up with just kind of this simple number of how long it takes us to double. It's not exact, it's an approximation. So if I'm growing at 1% a year, it takes me 72 years, 2%, 36. If I'm at 3%, it takes me 72 divided by 3 is 24 years to double. At 4%, it is 18. At 5%, we use 70 then because it makes life easier. It makes it an easier number to do, which is that 18 years too? No, it can't be. 12 is 14 years. Sorry, it's hard to do it in your head. But that's what we mean by the rule of 70 and 72. We just use 70 for things like 5, just to make it the number whole. So 5 and 7 is when you would use 70. That helps you. It's also in the book places as well. It's just a quick way to tell us how to double something. Good question. Because I don't believe it is on my slides. So every now and then I just wanted to see about discussion. Other questions? Sometimes I do forget things as well, so it's possible I didn't talk about it on Wednesday as well. I meant to if I didn't, so I'm sorry. Other questions?
Sorry, I do have one more.
Go ahead, not a problem.
So quiz, sorry, I'm getting massive feedback. Quiz 12A, how specific do we need to look into like the historic growth rates for various countries and all of that? Like, do we need to memorize those or anything like that?
I would just kind of have an idea of where countries fall there, kind of who's at the top and who's at the bottom, and where the U.S. fits.
Okay.
As always, you could print the table out and you can use your notes for the quiz. But I just kind of want you to kind of have an idea of where countries fall.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask specifically what was the U.S. growth rate on the table, but you should know the U.S. growth rate was right around 2%, which is right about the middle. Good question. Any other questions?